We begin our Barnsley Canal walk here, on what would have been the approximate location of the bridge that went over the canal at Shay Lane. In front of us is the approximate location of what was Lock 11. We take the public footpath on the left. Here we take a look back at what would have been the lock and the Shay Lane bridge. We're now looking up the former canal route. Lock 11 is behind us and the embankment of the canal is on our left hand side. We continue walking with Cherry Tree Estate also on our left. I used to regularly walk up the current part of the canal route with my granddad in the late 1970s. At that time the new housing estate on the right was not there and the whole area now occupied by it was farmland. When I first started walking this route with my granddad, the semi-detached houses now below us on our left had not yet been built. Their position below us demonstrates how high the embankment was on this part of the canal. Also, notice how steep the gradient is ahead of us. When planning the course of the canal engineers tried to stick to a particular contour line, but when they couldn't, they managed the problem of gradient by building locks. Just ahead, one of the locks of the old canal is still visible. I think it's lock 14. Here's a view of the lock looking back down our route. With a bit of imagination, you can picture the canal as it was going towards Shay Lane. The last lock has lifted us to the level of Waterstone's Wall, which protected the world's first nature reserve. When I first began taking the walks with my granddad, the canal still existed to this point, albeit heavily silted up and without much water to speak of, if I remember correctly. It was finally filled in when the semi-detached houses at the top of Cherry Tree that I mentioned earlier were built. Presumably they did not want to risk any water running down to them. Trees have since begun to reclaim the area back for nature. We're now coming up to the next lock. There's a big chunk of concrete running across the lock. This was present back when I went on the walks with my granddad. Presumably it was put there to act as a dam. This meant that the route we have just walked was normally quite empty of water before it was finally filled in. However, it would overflow after heavy rain. On the upper side of what I referred to as a dam, the canal was often quite full, especially after rainfall. I remember seeing large amounts of frog spawn in this part of the canal in early springtime. Here you can see two hefty pieces of metal and a curved area of stone just above the concrete dam. I presume that there were once steps hanging from these going down into the lock. You can see two more of these features at the far end of the lock on each side. Here on the right hand side you can see a mushroom shaped piece of metal that was presumably some sort of device to help pull the barges through the lock. There's another one of these on the opposite side. We now take a final look at the lock, looking back down our route. The next bit of canal after the lock does have a bit of water in it, but it's nowhere near like it was in the 1970s and 80s. We are now approaching Walton Hall Bridge. This was often the end point of my outward walk with my granddad before we made our way back. The road going over the bridge leads to Walton Hall, the former home of the naturalist and explorer Charles Waterton. The bridge gives us a good opportunity to look back down our route. Here you can see marks on the bridge, presumably caused by abrasion from ropes or whatever was used to pull the barges. Here you can see the same marks in the sandstone at the other end of the bridge. Here's a view back on the bridge from a bit further up the canal. The canal looks dried up in this area. Much of it is now being taken over by trees and shrubs. The way it looks today here reminds me of the part of the canal between Cherry Tree and the second lock that we looked at before it was filled in. In the 70s it was full of water here and actually looked like a canal. We're now approaching the next canal bridge, which is called Hoare Park Bridge. Here the canal is surrounded by the steep rock faces of a cutting that was necessary for the canal to maintain its contour line. Looking down on the canal from just above, you can get an idea of how deep the cutting actually is. The construction of this part of the canal would therefore have been a rather expensive undertaking. If I recall correctly, I heard somewhere or read somewhere that the cutting was necessary because the Watertons refused to let the canal go across part of the Walton Hall estate. Here you can see part of the decaying wall that marks the boundary of that estate. I sometimes got as far as Hoare Park Bridge in the walks with my granddad on days when he was feeling particularly fit. I'm not sure why, but my granddad always referred to the bridge as Easter's Bridge. I include reference to this here just in case it makes sense to somebody in the future. I rarely went much further than the bridge with my grandad, and this was, sort of, the edge of our shared world. However, there are two more bridges that we will look at in this video. The cutting continues for a while as we move away from Hoare Park Bridge. We are now at a point after we have moved out of the cutting. Here, the canal starts to have a much greater amount of water in it, though in time this will undoubtedly dry up like we've seen elsewhere. In the late 1970s, this is more what the canal looked like from the second lock that we explored earlier. Here we approach the next bridge, which is called Clayroyd Bridge. As you can see, this bridge looks quite different to the others that we have seen. I presume that there was once a stone arch that must have collapsed at some point to be replaced by what we see today. We now move away from Clayroyd Bridge. The canal begins to turn rather sharply up ahead. We're now approaching another piece of canal infrastructure. This will have been a device used to help guide the tow ropes of the barges to help the barges move round the sharp corner. The canal continues to be quite full of water for a while. However, it then becomes like you see here. We're now approaching the last bridge that we'll be looking at in this film. This is called Blue Bridge. I looked this bridge up online and it's a Grade 2 listed building. It's here at Blue Bridge that I'll end this current film.